So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Business and Human Rights in the Garment Sector During COVID-19. I'm Adarsh and from Q Design, and I will be your technical facilitator today. Both the chat function and the Q&A will be on. So if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function. Please note that the session today will be recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message me, Adarsh, for help using the chat box. I will now hand over to Kevin to start the session. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adarsh, and thank you to all participants for joining us at this session at the second UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This session is organized by the University of Portsmouth and Equidem, for which we thank them a lot. The session will deal with the central question of how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted Asian textile and garment workers, and what responses a rights-based approach would require by a multitude of stakeholders. With us today are Professor Leila Shukroon, Professor of International Law at the University of Portsmouth, Nazma Akhtar, Founder and Executive Director of Awaz Foundation, Kamran Arif, Advocate at Equidem, which will likely join us in a second, Shubha Roy, Founder of Behavioral Insights, Architecture and Strategy, which stands for, or BIAS in its abbreviated form, Salil Tripathi, Senior Advisor on Global Issues at the Institute for Human Rights and Business, as well as journalist and novelist, among other designations. And last but not least, Joris Oldenziel, Deputy Director at the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety. Now, this session will be structured as a panel discussion. Professor Shukroon will set the context and provide her concluding remarks at the end of this session. Nazma and Kamran will highlight the lived experience from rights holders in South Asia. Nazma will focus specifically on Bangladesh, whereas Kamran will focus on Pakistan and the wider South Asian sub-region. Moving on, Shubho and Salil will talk about the actual or potential responses of businesses in dealing with the adverse impacts of the pandemic on textile and garment workers. While Shubho will shed a light on what suppliers have or could have done in this respect, Salil will focus mainly on brands, though he will also provide a more holistic view of business strategies. Finally, I'll ask Joris to reflect on the role of multi-stakeholder instruments, such as the Bangladesh Accord, in dealing with business human rights issues. I will also ask him how such instruments would be useful in dealing with future large-scale crises, including but not limited to pandemics. Having said all this, I would like to wish everyone a pleasant and informative session. I now give the floor to you to set the context of this session, Professor Shukroon.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to thank in particular the organizers. I'm thinking about Professor Surya Deva as well as RPS in yourself, Kevin. As you kindly said, I'm going to start to introduce or try to introduce the context. As you can see here from the slide, I think this pandemic, just as the UN Secretary General put it, is first and foremost a pandemic of human rights abuses. And this is what we're going to see as well in our particular case. As early as April 2020, that is just 1 year ago, the UN Secretary General identified the true issues behind the COVID-19 crisis. It is first and foremost, again, a pandemic of human rights abuses. And this for two main reasons. First of all, discrimination in the delivery of public services, revealing of the structural inequalities that impede access to them. Second, disproportionate effects on certain communities, the rise of hate speech, the targeting of vulnerable groups, something we've seen very clearly, and the risk of heavy-handed security responses are undermining the health responses and generally human rights. So this sort of extraordinary prescience has informed the UN response as much as it helped us frame how the COVID-19 has greatly impacted the most vulnerable, as illustrated today by our discussion on the textile and garment sector in Asia. a major economic force for the region, as you all know. My comments are based on fieldwork performed under the leadership of Professor Tabsin Bradley and myself from February 2020 to today in India and Bangladesh mostly, and the region generally, with a team of local colleagues. I know some of them are present today, from civil society and businesses, and in particular a very longitudinal interviews with narrators who were on the ground. So this is sort of a chart which shows how the pandemic is a pandemic of human rights abuses impacting all areas of life. The impact you have seen, for those of you following the sector, a number of quite striking phenomenon actually. Mass cancellation of orders to start with, then some sort of stress put on the lack of reliability and transparency in the supply chain. Workers, particularly women, have been laid off with no severance or notice and pay withheld for work completed, leaving the most vulnerable at risk of extreme labor abuses and to some extent as well some forms of what we call modern slavery. When production has continued, appropriate safety measures have often not been properly implemented. Living and working conditions were cramped with inadequate sanitation and hygiene facilities. We've seen as well reports with showing cutting or reducing pays, of course. You all remember, I'm sure you have all these images in mind of massive internal and international to a lesser extent, but internal mostly in India, migration. In India, maybe 40 or 60 million migrants needed to try to return home, really. We've also witnessed clear threats to and violation of the rule of law. In this regard, labor law has served as a sort of laboratory. We've seen increase of working hours, decrease of obviously minimum wage, collective bargaining threatened, demonstration forbidden. Also, we've noticed extreme inequalities in terms of access to technology. This has immensely impacted the work of our colleagues on the ground, in particular NGOs and unions, and their ability to cope with the crisis. So in a word, the COVID-19 has exposed and deepened vulnerabilities. It has not necessarily generated new risk or worse forms of labor abuses or slavery per se, but it has deeply exposed to different levels of vulnerability and ability to cope. In terms of responses, and I know the panelists are going to discuss that further, but we've seen interesting responses. Government and businesses as well as civil society have responded quite quickly, but they've not always been able to reach the most vulnerable again. So as far as donors are concerned, as I was saying, they've responded quite quickly from April with, for example, the ILO call for a response in the textile and garment sector. The Brown's response has been quite contrasted, really. As I said before, reducing and cancelling orders, requiring discount, payment terms negotiation, redeployment of basic inventory, and so on and so forth. It has confirmed what was, and it revealed also problematic issues. Great informality of the sector, we knew that before, but it became extremely problematic in this pandemic. Tracking and registration of workers, dependency on buyers, and general dependency of some countries to the sector. Some forms of corruption, the vulnerability of the supply chain. Of course, women were particularly at risk, child labor as well. There is no long-term system of social protection, also very complicated capacity or lack of capacity for workers to organize. However, on a more positive note, really, some local communities have shown resilience, and we have observed some capacity to support the workers very locally. So a number of issues have been raised really on the greater longer term. The need, I think, for intersectionality, we'll discuss that together, I'm sure. Also, we've seen that there is this possibility of transitioning between one category of worker to the other. So that's also something we have to discuss. And another really interesting sort of lesson learned is that we need probably to move from this very sectoral approach. What we are going to say about the garment sector is actually quite relevant generally for other sectors. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for those astute and very comprehensive remarks, Professor. Indeed, the pandemic has had an enormous impact across South Asia. And now that we have a broad idea of said impacts, I would like to invite Nazma into this conversation. Nazma, can you please reflect on how garment workers were impacted by COVID-19 in Bangladesh? Moreover, the Awaz Foundation has done commendable work in the past year. If you would like to share some of your experiences and observations from the ground in that context, that would be very interesting. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. All other guests. COVID-19, if I'm saying no respect and no dignity, perspective of the business and human rights player, they did only the mistake, brand and buyer who are producing good from Bangladesh and other country. The last year, March, when the lockdown start, they cancel the order, suspension and holding. After that, most of the Bangladeshi manufacturer, they laid off the factory, they retrenched the workers. There is no compensation, there is no proper benefit. As per legally, when the brand is asking for discount, and our Bangladeshi garments workers, April, March, they discount their 35% salary because nobody is taking the responsibility, nobody is there. And this impact, because most of the garments workers in Bangladesh are female and they came from the countryside, they are rural migrant. And its effect, the women's and Bangladeshi garments workers, more than 50% are single mother. Without husband, they are surviving. When they lost their job, some has 1 child, some has 3 children, and the factory was closed down and their life was vulnerable and begging. They have no shelter, they don't have any protection. And when they lost their job, all the workers went to the countryside and it's very badly affected our rural economy. Many of the women are pregnant and who used to work 10 years, 8 years, 5 years, they are eligible for the maternity protection, but they are denied and they are illegally dismissed because during the pregnant time, as per law, the workers can only resign, but nobody can terminate or dismiss them. But it's also happened. And they cannot pay their house rent. The landlord said, if you are not giving the money, you cannot take your household things. And our government in Bangladesh giving 3 months incentive soft loan when lockdown, but Bangladeshi manufacturer, they enjoy that incentive, but they are not giving the workers salary because our workers are like a daily labor. Our workers are like a piece rate workers and they earn like a hand to mouth and they don't get anything and they didn't get when they started the work in the factory in early May, because the store or online business or shopping, they need goods. Without workers, they cannot run the business. They are in the factory when they start. The factories try to look after about the safety, social distance, or some good initiative. But we have the problem, small, medium, large factory. Many factory doesn't have the space for the social distance. And after 1 week, 2 weeks, within 2 weeks, all the factory, they started 100% production and no social distance. They are trying to hand wash or maybe some spray kind of things, but not many things they are doing for even the safety issues. Some of the factory might be care very good and even they are making policy that they might, if they are affected by COVID, they will compensate that, even their family, but the percentage was good, bad. Even the April salary, few of the factory is giving full salary, but most of the factory is not giving. Most of the factory, when they open brand, they are not responsible, they are not accountable. Till now, the brand are monitoring, auditing with the virtual or digitalized. Not a single people are visiting the factory. If the factory workers are important, then all the brand and the supplier, the factory owner, the CEO and the owner should be inside the factory. But till now, even their compliance people are not visiting the factory, and only the workers, they work in the factory. And it is very difficult and unhuman things happen with the workers. And still our workers, many factory, the not sufficient order, some factory has shut down their most of the line, few lines are running. Now they don't have much overtime, they don't have much money. And because our workers are getting minimum wage less than $100, if they are not doing the overtime, they cannot survive. All the bad things are created by the globalization, new liberalization, capitalization, and the people are greedy, too much profit interested. They don't think about the workers' life and life. It's very much affected our workers' life and livelihood, and they don't get sufficient food even. People, when they lost the job, even the workers couldn't get their salary also on time. That is why the whole world, when they are talking about the social distance, safety, but our workers are fighting in the street how to get their salary. During the Ramadan time, Bangladesh is a big Muslim country, and people are fasting, and that time people need money, they need to get proper things, but they didn't get anything. Police versus workers, every day they are fighting. Even the brand, we are requesting the holding goods, but please pay the goods as soon as. They are not doing. That is why we need to campaign. And our foundation, as you know, it's a grassroots workers' organization. Then we are asking a lot of people for emergency relief. We are campaign for pay up with the remake. We have a lot of talk with the Brother Selis organization. And Laila also came before COVID in Bangladesh. And wherever we are trying to give the message, we are trying to give them. But there is also good things in Bangladesh. The union is increasing. And last year, COVID in July, our foundation supporting and helping one of the union has signed the collective bargaining agreement. And they have a very good, it's not a European American standard, but in Bangladesh or in South Asia, even the garments producing country, that collective bargaining can be the role model. So 10% yearly increment, the sanitary napkin, the women promotional, all kinds of things. And our foundation also working for empowering women workers and also factory level management. So we are also during the COVID time, we are collecting information, how many workers lost their job, how many workers didn't get their job payment. And we spoke to BGME, we send a lot of written to the government, and also we campaign against brand. Even the second wave when came, also our foundation is demonstration and raising voice not to cancel the order. So our question, the whole world is dependent on the garment, but why we are not getting our fair way thinking about this? Because the workers' life and workers'
Nazma, my apologies. Can I please ask you to wrap up your comments?
Livelihood is always threatened. So false cases also against them because when they are fighting for their full salary, social responsibility. What? And because our foundation, we are giving a lot of emergency support, COVID test, who lost their job. We are supporting them, and many still we are supporting, and we need health benefit and insurance policy. US is important for us to make the policy and give the agenda how this kind of things, if because Bangladesh or other countries not only
Nazma, I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little
social,
bit.
disaster, climate change. We now the time this COVID is learning to protect the workers. Without protection, thank you, because that can how we have to deal the issues. So that is why the social protection, unemployment scheme, freedom of association, collective bargaining, women's empowerment, gender issues, and health and safety is very important because the natural disaster is day by day increase, especially the climate change and environmental issues. So thank you, and we need to work together. We need to support each other, and we need to help, and we need to make better industry, and we need also skill women's workers and promotional things and women leadership. So this kind of things, if we have, then we can negotiation and we can get our things, because we are not against the business, we are not against the profit, but we are against the system. So the system has to be changed. The power should become to the workers. The workers should be get their real benefit, and then business will be sustainable, because without workers, business will not sustain. So let's work. We need to fill up our agenda 2030, and we need to strong, and we need to be sustainable industrial relation, and how to make sustain and respect women and their dignity and living ways, and freedom of association and collective bargaining is key, very issue. And I'm requesting all of them how we can make social protection and issues and how to compensate worker properly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nazma. These are very tragic circumstances that you have observed. And I think everyone agrees that it is imperative that these issues are addressed. So we will get back to these issues throughout the session, and we will now explore what could be done about this. So I would now like to turn to Shubo and turn to the role of businesses. So in 2020, UNDP launched a rapid self-assessment tool for business, which intends to stimulate thinking how to conduct human rights due diligence during COVID-19. Now, human rights due diligence is a concept outlined in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, through which businesses can identify and address actual and potential human rights impacts. Shubo, you and your colleagues have conducted a user testing of this tool among suppliers in Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam. Now, your extensive engagement with them has resulted in interesting findings. Could you please elaborate how suppliers have attempted to deal with COVID-19 and what difficulties they faced in doing so? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, so before I start talking about the question and the findings of the research, I would like to tell you all about this, that the talk would be structured in 3 parts. First would be what are the challenges that they faced in terms of running the business. Second are some of the implementation practices that they did, okay? And what's the potential for the tool? Adarsh, thanks for showing it. Can we move to the next slide? Move on. The purpose of this slide is only one, just to look at the economics behind it. Across India, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, look at the numbers that we're talking about, and look at it from the business perspective. Because for us to have a sustainable strategy going forward, there are 2 aspects to it. One, of course, is the workers' rights and the labor rights, but the other part is the business part of it when it comes to business and human rights. In India, it's a 38.70 billion apparel exports, employing 105 million people. Bangladesh, 4.4 million directly and 40 million, and a 34.1 billion, or 84% of the country's overall exports. Vietnam, third largest garment exporting country by volume, and accounts for 16% of the country's total exports, employing 2.5 million people and 80% women. The point that I'm trying to drive home at the very onset, that we are talking about huge scale, both in terms of monies and also in terms of employment opportunities. Let's move forward. In this context, when we started doing the research, my researchers would come back and say that there are three recurring narratives. First one is about the layoffs. You'll always hear about something or the other like this. The second one is about the declining revenue, how the business plans and the revenue objectives were completely got waylaid by the COVID, the pandemic, and the stringent government protocols. If I just quickly take a minute to read out the stringent government protocols part, and one of the quotes was that one of the instruction was from the ministry that if any case is found in a factory who is affected by COVID-19, then the management of the factory would be persecuted. Similarly, most, as Nazma was talking, that though we had researched the A-League suppliers or buyers in these countries, they're tier one, they're supplying to the big brands and the global conglomerates, okay? Yet they confess that they did have to lay off people. And there was a prioritization done. So they laid off in terms of the duration of employment with that organization. Or as Nazma was saying, some of them laid off the 10 months first. Third aspect of the third recurring narrative was the declining revenue. Now, at the face of it, these three seems very innocuous. Okay, that's the reality of life. But if you start thinking more about it, you'll realize that there's something else going on out here. Businesses mimic organisms like you and me. They mimic human beings. And when survival is at threat, evolutionary instincts kick in. And when evolutionary instincts kick in, there are three strategies that we all do. First, we kill some of our own. No, go back. Yes, we kill some of our own to save others. And that's exactly the justification was given for layoffs. We adopt. And that's exactly what they did. From the regular businesses, they started opening up new verticals. And it was mainly the production of masks or PPE kits. And the third one that you do is that you become wary of people who are more powerful than you are, which is about the government protocols. And that's exactly what all, irrespective of the country, all businesses did to survive. Kill some to save others, adapt to new verticals or business models, and try to completely become compliant with government protocols. As a result, look at the context of what happened. Can you move to the next slide? So this is what was a brief overview of the challenges faced by the government sector. Stage one, fall of orders from global markets. So quarter one, sales and revenue started getting impacted across geographies. Production comes to a complete standstill, existing orders could not be shipped, further affecting revenues, panic sets in, dealing with increasing costs, because some buyers commit to pay, others cancel orders, there are delayed payments, and because lockdown did not happen at the same time across the countries, so some of my shipments are stuck, my inventory is overloaded, and there's huge business repercussions of it. On top of it, government interventions. Bangladesh government provided companies with loans with very minimal interest rate, 2% to pay workers during the lockdown, but they did not know whom to pay, how to pay. There was chaos initially. And then when the unlock happened, it again took time for them to adapt to the new normal. And then orders resumed from UN, US, PP production almost to be vertical for some. So things started becoming a bit normal. And that during this period, there were certain interventions taken by the companies. And how did they adapt to that? Let's move forward. Other initiatives taken. So first and foremost, as we expected, the majority of the intervention of the focus was on occupational health and safety. So from your temperature checks, cleanliness, some of them created isolation centers. There were some training sessions given so that people do not fall sick, and if they there's complete awareness regarding the symptoms and all. Sanitization, posters and labeling, to a more complex amount of factory layout redesigning, and finally inspection by medical staff. So, but I would say majority of the interventions were on this, because there was also business angle to it. If one case was found, A, I would have got prosecuted by the government, B, it would have completely hampered the business operations of it. Moving forward, the second aspect was due to the bargaining power or the lack of it among the unions and the workers, and also government mandates, there was some financial support and employee welfare. Remember, we had gone to the A-leaguers who already had the resources and a system and the expertise in human rights. So there were counseling sessions done to address the psychological impact of COVID-19. There's claim of full pay during lockdowns and severance pays. Because honestly speaking, when your business model changes to a PPE production or a mask, and the government has regulations where they will only allow 30 to 40%, many of them could not retain everyone. And they had to let go of some people. However, at a claimed level, there were claims that they were paid fully and there was severance pay as per government mandates. I'm not going to get into a debate about whether the government mandates are good enough or not, where I think the other expert, Asma, has already spoken about it. Extended maternity leave, yes, pregnant women, smart move by the suppliers. Many of this maternity leave, women who were pregnant were prioritized for the leaves. Okay, work from home, and in certain cases, removing notice period and special leave policies. Moving forward. And then when you talk about it, some of the suppliers highlight some of their good practices. So for example, there's COVID isolation centers being created, changing factory layouts, okay, and counseling sessions. So they do talk about some of the good practices, and they do share the evidences with us. Yeah. Okay, moving forward. The potential of the tool. Now this is the part. The tool had 58 action points divided into 6 themes, okay, and it was simple yes, no, and responses. One of the key learnings of the research was that how the suppliers perceived the pandemic and perceived the potential of the tool. 3 uses of the tool. One, they believe that this tool can be relevant outside of the COVID. And that's something that we all must acknowledge, that today it's COVID. Tomorrow the contingency could be something else. However, it's such a wake-up call for everybody. And as Leela was talking about in a talk, that this has to move beyond the sectoral perspective. So it can be seen as a general risk management tool. The second part was that it should not be seen as a checklist which has to be done once. Rather, it should be a periodic assessment for factories through this tool. Last but not the least, prescriptive guidances. So which means provides thought starters on issues that companies can look into or work on specifically. For example, stigma and discrimination of COVID affecting others. These suppliers had no, I won't say idea, but they need more help on this front. Okay, my last minute, the next slide, please. Further areas of exploration of the tool, which could also be taken as suggestions by the suppliers, are that expand on the occupational health and safety, provide more guidance on those parts, like in terms of garment factory, questions on factory layout, seating plans, social distancing measures, they need more support and help. Transportation. How do you provide transport for workers in absence of public transportation? These are things which government, which the civil society and others have to think of. Similarly, labor rights. In terms of labor rights, social protection post-pandemic, grievance redressal, which is an ongoing one. Lastly, but not the least, environmental and community impacts. What happens once the person leaves the factory premise? Last point, corporate and management considerations. In the future, ethical sourcing commitments being honored, whether it's with regards to changing prices, discounts, and cancellations. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shubho, for this interesting data. This will definitely be very useful going forward. And I mean, we should also consider how to integrate this into the work of all relevant actors, whether they be public or private. And I would also like to point out that UNDP and BIAS will share these findings in the near future. So please keep an eye on our website, and I'll copy the website in the chat box, and I'll also provide a link to the rapid self-assessment for whoever is interested. Now, having said that, I would like to turn to Salil. Salil, you have also conducted various researches on business and human rights and COVID-19 for UNDP, but also for others. Your research on COVID-19 was in Bangladesh, and my question for you is the following. What did businesses do to protect the rights of workers, and what more could they have done? And if you could please focus on brands, that would be very interesting. But please also feel free to share more holistic reflections as you always do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, very kind of you. And thank you, everyone, and particularly the UNDP for organizing this wonderful event. And it's great to be on a panel with all of you experts. I also want to say at the outset that the research that I'm going to speak about is something we are doing together with the Subir and Malini Chaudhary Center for Bangladesh Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. And my co-authors are Sanchita Banerjee Saxena and Nancy Mullins Reyes. It's just that they happen to be in California, which is even further back west of me, and it would be an unearthly hour. Otherwise, they would be joining us and listening and speaking in this panel too. So I just wanted to recognize that. Leela, you set out the picture very well about what happened in the human rights crisis. That I mean, it's as important or as significant in terms of as a black swan moment as 9/11 was in some ways, in terms of changing the way the world looks at human rights, and also the 2008 financial crisis. So it's almost like every 10 years we have to go through this and re-examine human relationships with human rights, and that's important. And Nazma, of course, I always learn from you, and we spoke to you for this research, and it was your impassioned and powerful words were very important. And Shubho, your findings that you spoke about from what you have done with on the field in 3 countries, we did talk to some companies as well, so we have some insights to share which might be useful from the perspective of local companies and not brands. Just to explain the methodology of what we have done, it's a qualitative survey that we have done. We have not done a comprehensive mass survey. We did one with the BRAC University, which looked at the workers' responses, to which we allude to in our report, but I won't go into the details about that now. But what we certainly did was to speak to 10 international brands drawn from Europe and the US, very large names. We are going to name them in the report, but we are not going to ascribe individual remarks to the companies, what they said, in order to facilitate a more candid conversation. We also spoke to 5 local companies, that is Bangladeshi manufacturers, to see how they experience the crisis. We spoke to unions in Bangladesh, both Nazma and Kalpana, and we also spoke to international organizations which have either been campaigning or monitoring the way the whole situation has unfolded. So it's not as comprehensive as it ought to be, because there are many other players such as ILO and so on, which we can also speak to, but we wanted to speak to those who are directly involved and related to what happened. Now, one of the things we need to bear in mind about Bangladesh is the unique nature of the industry. It does not grow a lot of cotton. It does not manufacture the equipment, and it has homegrown capital and it has abundant supply of skilled labor force, which is inexpensive by international standards. And that's the reason Bangladesh is in the position it is, second or third largest exporter in the world, depending on which criteria, whether you consider European Union as one or as separate entities. So I think that's where it stands, 4.5 million workers, more than 4,000 factories. It used to be 6,500. There has been some consolidation post-COVID, so that is something that needs to be borne in mind. What happens to the factories that have folded up? Some factories have as many, lots of facilities with more than 225,000 workers spread over 30 or 40 factories. Some are rather small with 800 or 1,000 workers each. So that's the kind of setup in which the industry is. And virtually every major brand, with one or two exceptions, virtually every major brand in the world procures and sources from Bangladesh. It's an extremely important element for the global supply chain. And within Bangladesh, it's a huge foreign exchange earner. It's an extremely important part, and it has a significant role in women empowerment. And the point there to note about that is that exactly that, something like between 53 to 80% of the workforce in every company we spoke to is women, and that is a significant achievement both in terms of SDGs and Bangladesh's own goals towards ESG rights realization and so on. Now, what did we learn? One of the things we learned was that there were indeed mass cancellations. Companies were candid about it, that they did cancel contracts. With the exception of one company, no company invoked the force majeure contract. A force majeure is this part of the contract which allows a company to renege because of quote unquote an act of God or war or natural disaster. Now you can make a very good case that what happened was indeed unanticipated, unprecedented, and difficult to account for. So this is not a comment, critical comment, but it is just an observation that a lot of companies felt that let's see what's going on. Let's understand from the markets what the demand is, what consumers want, how it is going to get reshaped. All of us started, not all of us, but there's a statistic which shows that 2 out of 5 jobs in the world can be done at home, but the other 3 cannot. So those of us who could work from home learned to work with sweatpants rather than trousers, right? So immediately there's a fall in the demand for trousers. Immediately there's a fall in demand for jackets because people are working from home. So all these things had an impact, and the industry needed to understand how the industry had to be reshaped. So there was that aspect of it about understanding the new dynamic in the market. That was one phenomenon that was going on. A lot of companies were genuinely scared, the brands. What if we go under? There's a liquidity issue because the entire industry is working in such a just-in-time manner that you procure and sell, and that the time is very little, all the deadlines are tight. And if there is an interruption in flow, the cash cycle closes down. So people wanted to conserve cash. So a lot of companies acted in what they thought were their interests. And therefore, to preserve cash, they decided to stop payment or delay shipments or delay the order, or say, you hold on to it, we'll pay you when we can, but don't make anything else. Now, that's wonderful in a way from self-preservation point of view. But if you look at it from the perspective of the local companies, they'd already paid for the raw materials. They're sitting with stocks of cotton. Their workers who are looking for their salaries and their Eid bonuses, because Eid is, as Nazma was saying, is a very important festival in Bangladesh. That was coming up. And at that time, suddenly to be saddled with the stock and not being able to send across, that was going to be a problem, and not send across the goods. So it was a squeeze moment. And at that time, Bangladesh government did provide some assistance, which was certainly not sufficient because, it allowed the companies to pay, the local companies to pay 65% of the salary to the local staff, as Nazma was saying. But we have to remember that the average wage for the worker is 8,000 taka, which is something like 93, 94 US dollars a month. Now, if you cut 35% of that, then the worker is certainly going to get worse off. So there are cases of malnutrition, there are cases of access to healthcare, but sometimes where people do have to pay for it. So people were being driven further down on the scale of poverty. So that's something. And the point to note, however, is that companies were being aware of that. And companies are not monoliths. One thing we discovered was that there were people who were managing finances in companies who had one way of looking at it, which is to preserve the company. But there were people in the company who are managing supply chain, stakeholder relationships, sustainability relationships. And some of them are, have worked with trade unions before or human rights organizations. So there was an interesting creative tension within the companies about how to react. And some of those cases the supply chain managers were successful. In some of the cases, the financial guys were successful. What it shows is there was no coordinated response of any kind, and there cannot be. One of the interesting things that we did find, however, was that Bangladesh is a very unusual country in the sense that it has had cyclones, it has had flooding, it has had what they call hortal, which is the meaning for strike, political unrest. That is a fairly common feature in Bangladesh. And therefore, the businesses that do business in Bangladesh and companies that operate in are used to uncertainties. So it was not completely unprepared. And of course, the Rana Plaza crisis of 2013 and the Tazreen factory fire of 2011 had prepared the Bangladeshi industry to anticipate and act in ways when something goes spectacularly wrong. So those were the good part. The bad parts were, of course, that the result is that all these individual decisions, when you're taken collectively, led to a situation in which the people who were the most vulnerable, the most affected, the most hard-pressed, the workers, they found that going very hard. I mean, there are stories we have heard that workers had gone off to back home because of the lockdown. They were asked to return, and they were asked to return without adequate transport being provided, and so on. Now, when we spoke to the brands and said, what did you do about it? They were very willing to provide extremely good, accurate information to the local companies about what they should do. What are the protocols? What does WHO say? What is the industry best practice about social distancing? And what are the kind of things they would like to see, such as sanitizers, wash basins, such as the need to have more space between various looms that are operating in a factory, or the need for curtains of some kind so that, or stagger the production so that, everybody's not working at the same time, the shifts are changed and so on. Now, all of that is in a way a good thing, but no checks were written. I think that's worth noting that a lot of the costs that had to be borne for making the changes had to be borne by the local factories. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a debatable point, and it's a separate issue. But the impact of that was that the Bangladeshi manufacturer felt under squeeze. And that did create a problem. Yes, it is true that some companies did go bankrupt, international brands. Some companies stopped operating because they could not operate their malls anymore. There was no footfall. There were no customers going to boutiques to buy clothes. So there was that problem, certainly. But at the same time, because of that going on and because of that happening, the manufacturer on the ground was the one who was stuck in a situation that they had to deal with it in a very critical and crucial way. So what we know from now is that the supply chain is going to remain as it is. There are not going to be many changes. Reshoring is not that easy. We can go into that in the question and answer part. I know I'm running out of time, but I think what we will need certainly in this context is a way for a much more robust safety net. And going back to the UN guiding principles, not to forget the role of the state. There is a role for the Bangladeshi government and for the international community to make sure that these supply chain mechanisms, which are economically efficient, are also socially desirable and viable. Thank you.
Thank you, Salil. Those were excellent reflections as always. Let's see how many questions we receive in the Q&A box. I would have some questions too, but I would want to encourage others to please use the Q&A field first. Having said that, finally, Joris, the Bangladesh Accord has been doing important work ever since various huge fire disasters in Bangladesh factories since 2013. Now, for those that may be less familiar with the Accord is a legally binding agreement between global brands and retailers, Industrial Global Union and UNI Global Union, and Bangladeshi affiliated unions. So the Accord seeks to ensure safe working conditions in factories. And one of the unique characteristics of the Accord is that it seeks to bring about change by leveraging the involvement of various stakeholders through binding commitments. Now, this is very much in line with the UNGPs, which acknowledge that different approaches, public, private, or corporate and civil society, national and international, are required to tackle business and human rights issues. Now, Joris, turning to you, may I ask you, what role do instruments such as the Accord playing in addressing business and human rights problems, first of all, and then second, more specifically, could you please reflect on what they can do to respond to large-scale crises, such as COVID-19 and future pandemics, but also to other crises, such as climate change and all the related crises that may cause? So yeah, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the UNDP for organizing this extremely interesting and timely session. So as Kevin said, the accord is a legally binding agreement between, on the one hand, garment brands and retailers, and on the other hand, global trade unions, the global union federations, UniGlobal and Industrial, as well as their Bangladeshi trade union affiliates of Industrial. And we also have 4 witness signatories, which are NGOs, Clean Clothes Campaign and Worker Rights Consortium, amongst others. And this initiative was signed in just a few weeks after the Rana Plaza building collapse in Bangladesh. And that, of course, was, as Kevin said already, and Salil was also referring to that, there has been a lot of factory fires and disasters in Bangladeshi garment factories for many years. And so the Rana Plaza building collapse was really a sort of final culmination of many past tragedies. So what the Accord has done over the years has been working, inspecting factories. So more than 200 brands and retailers have signed up to the Accord, and it's a legally binding agreement whereby the Accord Secretariat is an independent secretariat with an independent inspections program, whereby we inspect all the factories that are covered under the program. So all of the brands and retailers have to list all the suppliers that they are sourcing from in Bangladesh, and then the Accord inspects them for fire and building safety and develops a corrective action plan that then the factories have to implement according to a time scale that's been set by the independent chief safety inspector. And one of the interesting things about the Accord is that it has really, because of the large scale of the operation, so with 200 major brands having signed the Accord, the coverage is about 1,600 factories. So that's more than 1/3 of the total number of exporting factories in Bangladesh. And with that, the Accord has really been able to bring about systemic change in the industry. And that is quite an interesting phenomenon, because in many other instances with multi-stakeholder initiatives, you see that they are often quite small scale, whereas the Accord has really been able to bring about large-scale improvements throughout the many factories that are covered under the program. The Accord has a couple of other very interesting characteristics, which are indeed quite in line with the UN guiding principles, such as the high level of commitment to transparency and disclosure. And what is also very important, there's an equal decision-making between, on the one hand, trade unions and their workers and their representatives, and on the other hand, brands and retailers. So it's 50% decision-making in the board of the Accord Steering Committee. And I think that's an important element, because in the UN guiding principles, it's also made clear that for private initiatives like the Accord, those that are really impacted, that are potentially impacted, which is of course in this case the workers, should somehow be involved in the governance. They should have ownership within the governance of those initiatives that actually try to help them in any way. And so that is what the Accord does. It has workers and their representatives directly involved in the governance on an equal basis as the brands and retailers. As to your question, like what role do these instruments can play in addressing business and human rights issues, I think what is important to note is that the Accord was really able to help brands and retailers take their corporate responsibility to respect. If you look at the UN guiding principles and the 3 pillars, you have the state duty to protect, you have the corporate responsibility to respect, and of course the access to remedy pillar. Well, the Accord fits really well in the 2nd pillar of the corporate responsibility to respect, and that responsibility exists independently of a state's ability or willingness to protect human rights. And Rana Plaza was a stark realization for many of the stakeholders, including many brands, that the Bangladesh government and its own fire and building safety inspections were unable or unwilling, it doesn't matter, unable to ensure and guarantee workplace safety in all the factories that they're sourcing from. So through the accord, they are taking their own responsibility to respect. And another element which you often see as part of the UN guiding principles is the issue of leverage. And so what the accord also achieved, because it's a legally binding agreement, means that all the brands and retailers have to comply with the same level of obligations. And that has created a massive collective leverage. And if you see at the what the UN guiding principles and the interpretive guide and all the interpretations that have been developed on the basis of that often say, is that if a brand wants to change the behavior of its supplier to which they are directly linked for their products and services, they have to exercise their leverage on that supplier. And then if they don't have enough leverage, they have to increase their leverage. And only as a last resort, as a last step, is possibly terminating their relationship. And that's exactly how the accord works. Even the smallest brand in the accord, which maybe has only a small percentage of production for a certain factory, may on its own not have all that much leverage towards that supplier. But through the accord, it has the collective leverage of all the brands, because if the supplier doesn't remediate in a timely manner, it risks being terminated from the accord program and being made ineligible to produce for any of the 200 accord brands. So it's that collective leverage that has been able to bring about that change. And also what is quite important is that the accord has a provision of ensuring that remediation is financially feasible. So not only are all sorts of workplace safety demands placed on the factories, also the brands have committed to making sure that the remediation is financially feasible. And the accord has, over the last years, facilitated many discussions between brands and factories on financing of the remediation, looking at the corrective action plan and looking at how much does it cost to install a fire alarm system, how much does it cost to install fire doors, and what can the brands do to support the factory making those investments, for example, through advance payments to future orders, longer term order commitments, larger order volumes, higher prices, all sorts of mechanisms have been utilized. So I think that those fundamental components of the accord make it a very interesting model to address other business and human rights issues. For the accord, of course, the focus was very much on fire and building safety, but there is no reason to not look at other issues, labor rights issues, and follow the same approach of having a legally binding agreement, ensuring that all the participating brands can be held to the same obligations. As it relates to your question, what the response of the accord has been to the crisis and how it could respond to future crises going forward, we have, of course, a limited mandate in terms of monitoring fire and building safety, but our complaints mechanism is broader and covers all OSH issues. And therefore, as soon after the pandemic broke out, the accord decided that COVID-19 related complaints, even though this is more of a public health issue rather than a workplace safety issue, but of course the workers were also heavily impacted, as already been explained by many of the speakers before me. The accord decided that COVID-19 related complaints would also be covered under its OSH complaints mechanism. So we've dealt with many complaints from workers who were not paid their full wages, or who were unfairly dismissed, or were sent home and not paid when they had COVID-19 symptoms, or when they complained about lack of COVID-19 precautionary measures. The accord also issued various guidelines and measures for the factories to take to prevent COVID-19 transmissions in the factory. And we also instructed our inspectors, our engineers, to check that information First of all, we asked the brands to send that to the factories and receive pictorial evidence of the measures that they're taking. As far as pictorial evidence can be given, like social distancing and cleaning facilities at the entrance of the factory. But we also asked our engineers who would go to the factories after a certain period of suspension of inspections. In September last year, we resumed the inspections. We've asked our engineers to check on those COVID-19 measures. First of all, for their own safety, of course, because we didn't want to send our engineers to a factory where it's unsafe, but also for the purpose of making sure that those measures were taken for the workers in the factory. So through that, we have been able to at least contribute a little bit to the COVID-19 pandemic. One more point, I know that we're short in time. We've also been monitoring factory closures. Obviously in March and April, there was a large number, but we've been monitoring factory closures and worker layoffs since. And I think an initiative like the Accord could therefore be really interesting to look at also for future challenges where collective leverage and collective action is really needed also from the private sector. Thank you very much.
What is happening? Can you hear me? Sorry, I think, yeah. Thank you, Joris. That was a very interesting intervention, and it actually spurred some questions in me as well. But I also see that the Q&A box is being filled quite a lot at the moment. So with that, I would like to return to all the panelists and ask them quite a practical question, kind of to conclude and then go into the Q&A. So if there is, are there one or two concrete things that you would want to change in order to, have change these issues systemically, what would they be? And please keep your answers short, 1 or 2 minutes, so we have enough time for the Q&A, because I see really there's a lot of interesting questions in there. So first of all, I would like to go to Nazma. Nazma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm in remote countries. This noise, sorry for that. There, panelists are saying the challenges, also difficulties. So we want something which should be penalty for the brand also, if they are violating the any country laws and any regulation. And so-called that bankruptcy, it should not affect the workers' life and livelihood. We are very much vulnerable situation in the production country, and we are also be good role model like freedom of association, collective bargaining. It's very difficult, but there is also good option and good factory who are doing good for the workers and also it's impact the good productivity. They should get the award and they should get the benefit, and this kind of people should get the more business and more benefit, because our women workers are leading this industry, and always the people came to our country for the cheap labor. That concept needs to be changed. That kind of attitude should be changed, because less than $100, how the people are surviving? Bangladesh living cost is very high. So because the nutrition is very challenging for us, the education, the health, everything is very vulnerable in our life and livelihood. So as a workers, we want how we can get that kind of support and how we make better and good
I'm sorry, Nazma, we are losing you.
Because we don't have the daycare center. Most of the garments are countryside. There is no breastfeeding rights. And what kind of human rights we are talking? It's slave. injustice, even COVID-19. People are
Sorry, Nazma, my sincere apologies.
cheating with the workers. Injustice, because there are. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Hello?
your connection is really bad, Nazma.
Hello? Hello? It's okay?
I'm sorry, Nazma.
Yeah, so the problem, sorry, even me.
Can you please wrap up, Nazma? I'm sorry, we have difficulties hearing you, unfortunately.
Yes, so that is why we want that the business should be give our profit share. Business should need to support the workers when they have this kind of things, because our workers has no security. There is no protection. There is nothing. And how they have to, because Rana Plaza disaster, we thought that system has changed in the world, but no. Why? Because why everything has to pay by the workers? We want the fair wages and fair profit share. That can be changed the things. Otherwise, I mean, the job security, workers' voice, workers' freedom of expression, freedom of association, these kind of things we need to be concentrated. And the Western brand will say, we have this problem, we have this problem, our store is not running. The supplier will say, brand is close the order and we cannot pay the workers. That is not the excuse, because whole year when they get the profit, look at their yearly turnover and how much our workers get. This kind of talk and this kind of things we are talking year and year, but we are not getting anything. So this is the pandemic time. We suffer a lot, but we gave a lot. And what we get? Nothing we get from the European, American government. From that, only the European Union giving 3,000 taka for garments workers. Few only. Is this enough? What we contribute for the European Union, what we contribute for the America, Australia, and other countries, that profit, that kind of accountable, and we need legal penalty. We need the human rights violation law across the world, not only the supplier. It should be brand, because not a single brand is getting any penalty. And bankruptcy, it's not an excuse. And also, everywhere when workers raise their voice and workers are fighting, they are blacklisted, they are going to prison, but Rana Plaza collapsed.
Nazma, I'm sorry, can you please wrap up?
Ali Enterprise, lot of accident, lot of things happen. Not a single company or supplier getting any penalty. So that kind of legislation and that kind of, that we want. Thank you. Solution, where?
Okay, thank you, Nazma. Very important points raised indeed. Indeed, the need for binding and binding accountability. So I would like to ask all the other panelists to please keep their final conclusions brief so we can move on to the Q&A session. Please outline one or two practical things you would like to see changed for systemic change. Shubha, may I move on to you from the supplier's perspective?
Okay, the first and foremost is the perception has to be changed about the suppliers. They're not villains. We tend to often look at them as Shylocks, if I may quote, from Merchant of Venice. We need to work with them. We need to work through them. They are a very critical actor in the entire ecosystem. And we also have to look at another perspective, which is the sustainability of the business itself. As Salil was talking about it, if the businesses don't survive, then there's no point talking about the workers and their safeties and all these issues. To that aspect, there are 4 aspects that I'll quickly talk about. One would be that I think suppliers and other organizations should have a business plan, which is about an alternative scenario. This is bound to happen. Today it was COVID, tomorrow it would be something else. So most organizations should start building those scenarios in the strategic plan. That's a strategy level. There got to be something also at the financial planning part of it. There are two aspects I'll quickly talk about. Most balance sheets of these conglomerates would have something called a reserves and surplus, which is an accumulation of past profits. Now, though the argument that we often hear is that this year business has been bad and there would be a 35% reduction in the wages, I think it should be mandated, and it should also be generous of the organizations to earmark a certain amount of that reserve and surplus for such contingencies. And the second aspect within that would be a provision for contingencies. Usually you create a provision in your financials, a provision for ABC. There's also a channel, there's also a need to create and earmark a significant amount of your profits in this provision for contingencies. That's on the financial plan. Now coming to the third aspect of it, which is the labor strategies. One of the issues that we think, and Salil and Asma were talking about, is that most of them are not directly working for you. They're temporary laborers or they're invisible laborers, because you only have some permanent laborers and you're working for them. So first and foremost is to get them within the gambit. Okay, that's one. B, like we have a provident fund or a gratuity, there should be a contingency fund. And that's got to be some innovation done by the industry and others. The contingency fund usually work this way, that the employers put or the suppliers put a certain amount of contribution every month, and a similar contribution is put by the employees. Okay. And from my end, these are the three critical aspects that I want to talk about.
Thank you, Shubho. Turning to Salil, perspective from brands and business as a whole. Please keep it brief. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, I will be brief. The first point is, of course, the need for human rights due diligence. And, there's now in Netherlands and Europe and elsewhere, France already has a vigilance law. So I think there's more and more conversation about it. And I think they need to look at their impacts more clearly. And of course, even for people that are not directly employed by them, but those who are one or several steps removed, as in the supply chain. Once they do the due diligence, they will find one of the things that came up in our conversation. There's a very practical issue that this is what the suppliers told us, that, that they are not seen as secured creditors. You talked about balance sheets, and that's why I thought I'll take it slightly at a technical and accounting level. I did about 100 years ago, I was a student of accountancy and economics. So, I can talk about that. But I think the fact that they're seen as unsecured creditors means that when it comes to, if a company does go bankrupt and you're going to do away with their assets and start paying off the creditor, they often come at the bottom of the chain of people to be paid off. And unless the suppliers are paid off, the workers won't get paid off. So again, the whole point is that, the people who are the most vulnerable are the ones who are going to get paid the least or not at all. Whereas those who are comfortable and well off, the bankers and so on, are going to get an earlier exit. Now, this of course means reimagining capitalism, and that's not something that is the target of our session here today. But it's something that's worth bearing in mind, and maybe contractual provisions can be made for speedier and quicker payments, regardless of the bankruptcy procedures. And I'm not an expert on it. I'm not a CPA, but people should certainly look at that. And the other is the responsibility of the consumers. I think it's worth bearing in mind that, one of the things that I noticed after Rana Plaza was that 2 days later, I was in London in those days, and I went to Oxford Street at one of the big stores where you get T-shirts for £5. And all the young people who are the ones who immediately sign on to petitions, and they talk about the need for better no sweatshop and no slavery conditions and all that. They're very quick to sign on to that. None of them felt it was necessary that maybe what it would mean, instead of £5, that T-shirt will cost £7. That the realization hadn't dawned. And I think there's something that needs to be done about this fast fashion model of the industry. It needs to be re-examined. Now, I'm not saying that therefore everything should be costing more, because I'm not at all saying that lifestyle should be inaccessible to the poor. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I think there is a certain element of affordability. Maybe the margins can be squeezed in the chain itself. And again, it's something that people have to examine more thoroughly. And again, we should not forget the role of the state. I think there is absolutely no reason where the most vulnerable part of the chain, which is the workers, has to, go and wonder and has to shout every time for justice. That should not happen. And for that, the state has to build better safety net. And if that means that the contracts that are negotiated by brands with the supplier needs to put aside some money that pays for either health insurance or some kind of a pension or some kind of a provision. Those are the kind of creative solutions we need at a very practical level, because I mean, it would be nice to reimagine capitalism, but that's going to take a long time.
Thank you, Salil and Joris. Then I would like to turn to you. And actually, I see there's a lot of questions in the Q&A box that have been posed to you. So I will also come back to you. So again, please keep it brief. Thank you.
Yes, well, I'd like to copy what Salil was saying, that I think it's very important to look at the developments as it relates to the human rights due diligence legislation. As we know, legislation has just been introduced in Germany. We've had the Modern Slavery Act in the UK. There's a law proposal just last week being tabled in the Netherlands. And of course, there's the EU developments with regards to the mandatory due diligence. And I think that those developments should be really carefully looked upon, both from the policy development perspective, but also for the brands themselves, because once such legislation is in place, the brands will have to have systems developed in order to be able to exercise that due diligence obligation. And I think initiatives like the Accord could come into play there very helpful. And therefore, I mean, already responding to some of the questions in the chat box about questions related to can the Accord expand to other countries or to other standards, I think the answer would be yes. There's nothing preventing brands and trade unions to negotiate similar agreements or expand the existing agreement to cover other labor standards and also to go to other countries if there is the EU mandatory due diligence legislation. Brands will have to exercise their due diligence in all the countries that they source from. And why not do that collectively through an initiative like the Accord? Thanks.
Thank you, Joris. And now actually, I would like to go a little bit off script, if that's okay. So Leila, I know you haven't provided your concluding remarks yet. I was wondering, could we do your concluding remarks after the Q&A? So we go into the Q&A now, and I would like you to give you the floor to see if you have any questions, please post them. If not, we'll go to the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin. I can do the concluding remarks after the Q&A. That will be even more interesting. I do have plenty of questions, but I'd like to give the floor to our colleagues and the audience here.
Sure. Okay. I mean, we can come back to your questions as well. Let me. My apologies. My computer is freezing a little bit. Okay. Sorry. So there is a question by Sin. There's a question. While we appreciate efforts to uphold rights enshrined in ILO conventions, can any real progress be made without workers enjoying freedom of association? Rana Plaza is a worst-case example of what can happen when workers can't exercise this right. And on a related note, how would you gauge trade union freedoms in South Asia? Now, this question was posed to Celine and Joris, but I would also invite others. Leila, would you want to respond to that?
Of course, Kevin. Well, thank you very much for this question. It's extremely important. As you know, I started the introduction to this session in saying that it was, of course, a pandemic for human rights or of human rights violation. And we've seen clearly in Asia that labor rights, and in particular, the right to unionize, the right to bargain collectively, the right to demonstrate have been repeatedly violated. So there is no reason for that. It's not because it's a pandemic that you have to violate basic human rights. There is no financial reason. There are political reasons. So you're absolutely right. I think at one point we need to go back to the basic and reaffirm and fight again for these very simple basic rights, which have been denied to all workers everywhere in the world, not only in Asia during the pandemic, which is something extremely, extremely scary.
Thank you. Salil, would you want to comment on this as well? I will get back to Joris with a different question.
Yeah, no, sure. No, very quickly. I mean, we have Nazma joining us, and there are other very fine trade union leaders in Bangladesh itself. And the question, I think, is broader about South Asia. So there are unions. There are two issues there. That the independent trade union, the kind that Nazma runs, they find it hard to get their voices heard because many of the trade unions are connected to political parties. And that does create a very difficult situation because political parties then have contradictory impulses. If their party happens to be in power, then they have a different way of looking at it. If their parties, people who are supporting their political party are in power, the businesses, then those businesses also find it a little easy. So that creates a more difficult situation. People tend to talk about the fact that unions are violent, but one has to always look at the roots of the violence. And this is not to justify any violent action by anybody, but sometimes when somebody is driven to violence, it is necessary to see where it comes from. And if there's a perpetual tendency on the part of the state to disregard or undermine rights and even move away from ILO convention, then there is a problem. I'm not therefore saying that violence is justified. In fact, India has a fine tradition of extremely good non-violent unions, the one that Gandhi had started, one that Ela Bhatt runs out of Ahmedabad. So you have a situation like that can happen. But absolutely right, core conventions matter and union freedom does matter. All that we can say that we have incredibly brave warriors such as Kalpana, such as Nazma and others in Bangladesh who work towards it.
Thank you, Salil. And then to Joris, I have a question. Do you believe it would be feasible to expand the scope of labor rights topics, like the scope of the accord, so to other topics, human rights, environment, broader human rights or environment? And second, do you think that a similar accord model would be effective in other countries? Oh, and also to the first, actually, if you would want to expand the scope, could that be done within the same accord, or would you need a separate agreement for that? Sorry, that was a bit scattered, but I hope you got the question.
Yeah, needed to change my headset. I just wanted to check if you can still hear me.
Yes,
now?
We can hear you.
Good. All right. Yeah, so a lot of questions, but sort of centering around the same issue, which is to what extent could the accord go to other countries or could be expanded to be covering other standards? Well, first of all, the current accord agreement is expiring at the end of May of this year. And therefore, it's important that the brands and trade unions that make up the accord are going to negotiate a new agreement. And with that opportunity to negotiate a new agreement is also the opportunity to, of course, see whether there's interest to expand to other countries and whether other standards could be added. I think one of the success factors of the accord has, on the one hand, been its focus, just to look only at fire and building safety. So I think if there is an expansion to other standards, that it would need to be very clearly defined and very clearly articulated what is the standard against which the companies will be legally held to account and how that would be inspected and remediation would be monitored. But as I said earlier, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be expanding to other standards. And also I want to point out that even though the accord does fire and building safety inspections, so fire, electrical, and structural safety inspections at the factories, and going forward, boiler safety inspections will be added. The coverage of the OSH complaints mechanism has been much broader. So we've also been looking at excessive working hours, at maternity pay, workplace violence, unfair dismissals, and also freedom of association in relation to protecting worker safety. So if, for example, workers were trying to organize in order to address workplace safety in the factory, that would be covered under the and they would be somehow prevented from doing so, or there would be retaliation against them, that would be covered under the OSH complaints mechanism. So we already have a very broad interpretation of OSH under the complaints mechanism. And as to the question as what would be the challenges of going to other countries, of course, a very practical question would be setting up the whole organization there and the inspections regime. We have more than 200 people on staff we've had more than 200 people on staff in Bangladesh. So if you want to do a similar program in Pakistan or India, you would have to set up and build up the engineering and complaints handling and case handling capacities in those countries. But again, if the brands are willing to do so, and if trade unions are willing to do so, then I don't see a reason why it couldn't be possible. And in fact, they are sourcing from those countries. So I think they do have a responsibility to identify the key risks in their supply chains in those countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Joris. That's very encouraging to hear. Now, so I actually wanted still to select a question for Salil, but considering that we're running out of time, I would first want to go to Leila, Professor Shukroon, to enable you to provide your concluding remarks based on everything you've heard today. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm sharing my screen, so tell me if you can see it, because I think we
cannot. Oh, now we can.
we
Yes, we can.
Right, fantastic, because I think we had technical problems before. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much to everyone who's participated in this panel discussion. Obviously, we don't have enough time to address all the issues we've discussed seriously. But however, if we look back at the impact and all the issues we identify as an introduction, the cancellation of order, the transparency in the supply chain, the fact that women were particularly affected, safety measures, working issues, the reduction of pay, migration, threat to the rule of law and labor laws in particular, as well as access to technology, all that has been confirmed by our panelists and our discussion. So a few concluding remarks here. I very much like the fact that Nazma addressed the issue or approached the issue through the lens of dignity at work, and the idea of transitioning between categories of workers and vulnerabilities. The dignity of workers is extremely important, and it's not simply a buzzword. You know, when you don't have work, you don't have a salary, you don't have food, you do not exist anymore. So as Salil was also alluding to later, do we need to suppress this type of capitalism to be a bit maybe more revolutionary, or reimagine it, reimagine the fast fashion? That's a little bit the idea of the fashion revolution. In any case, again, as Nazma stressed, there is no such thing as a victimization approach. It's not a charity based on arbitrariness. Workers have right, they have right to unionize, right to collectively bargain, and they are the power, they are the producer. So we need to address this issue through a rights-based lens, and that's a long time we're saying that. We're talking about a right-based approach for the past 20 years, really. It's nothing new, it's nothing related to the pandemic. I also very much appreciated what Shuba said on the need to have longer term perspectives and longer term partnership. As Shuba rightly said, it's such an important sector in Asia, such an important sector in Bangladesh. Can you imagine 84% of Bangladeshi exports? It's crazy, really. It's extraordinary. So how to survive during a pandemic, how to survive for businesses, and how to focus on greater maybe issues than simply occupational health and safety, as some of them have tried to do, but that's probably not enough. Then as Salil, as Shuba again was saying, we've learned quite a bit in terms of a more holistic response, and there is certainly something to do as far as finance is concerned. It's quite unimaginable to think that these companies didn't really have some reserve, right? So how do you provision for contingency indeed, and how do you plan risk in a managerial environment? You always talk about risk, and in fact you see when there is risk, when there is a crisis, that nothing has been planned really, even if it's difficult to plan the COVID-19, but there are other sorts of risks. Think about Bangladesh, it's a country which is often flooded, for instance, so there are risks, right? So working on finance is certainly something very interesting. Salil again addressed the weaknesses and limitation of the supply chain with, in particular, this concept of force majeure, which has been invoked quite largely by company. It reminds me of, the investment state dispute settlement. That's something we see quite a bit at the moment. However, force majeure as a legal concept is difficult to invoke. But nevertheless, it's true that we need to rethink the whole model, as we said before, the just in time, to anticipate much better than we do. Salil also stressed the role of the state. That's right, I understand that, of course, Salil, the state has a role. However, if you look at this here, suppliers in Bangladesh reported that 98% of buyers refuse to contribute to the cost of paying the partial wages to furloughed workers that the law requires. So I'm all right with the state taking the lead, you see, but when rights are not implemented, what exactly can the state do? And states, as you know, are often less powerful than businesses. Now we move to Joris and and the idea of intersectional and holistic approaches. Very interesting to see the role of ACCOR. You explained what the organization does in a very legally binding manner. So that's also fascinating. And you've also exposed, Joris, very nicely how the ACCOR has managed to find some sort of flexibility and creativity to address the COVID-19 in taking the complaints. I would have personally a few questions on, I know we don't have much time, but on how exactly you've done that and what you could remedy. And of course, again, the idea of due diligence echoing Sally. So my own personal sort of conclusion would be to sort of, address this question in a post-sectoral approach, because the lessons we've learned really are exportable to all sorts of sectors. Of course, garment is a prevalent sector in Bangladesh, certainly very important in India and Pakistan, in Vietnam. But what we discuss, migration, vulnerability, women, flexibility, creativity, finances, is exportable to absolutely all sectors. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're muted, Kevin.
Sorry, yeah, here I am. Thank you, Professor Shukroon. I was just saying to colleagues here in the same room, which you cannot see because I have my camera zoomed in, but what excellent and comprehensive concluding remarks those were. So thank you so much for those. I see we have gone over time, but if you just take 5 more minutes, I would like to do 2 things. I would like to give the floor to Salil for 2 minutes, and then I would like to conclude by giving the floor to Nazma, because she has also indicated on the Q&A that she wanted to pose a question, so I'd want to give her that opportunity. Let me just, if I open the Q&A. Salil, there was I'll just do it from the top of the head. There was a question about whether you have seen that brands helped suppliers remediate human rights issues in their supply chain. And also I was wondering, like, if they have these intentions, are there any problems with, setting goals at the corporate headquarters, and then does that trickle down into the supply chain? So if you could very briefly comment on that, perhaps, that would be great.
So as you're saying, what you're asking about is whether the suppliers were doing enough. Now, what they tell us is that, yes, they were doing enough, and that they will always do so, because, this is the story they want to tell. And unions will quite rightly say it is not enough. I mean, that will always be the situation. It will be the same even with the brand. And I think with the brand, and I think what we are seeing is a situation where there is a passing of responsibilities because of lack of clarity, because what are the expectations? To what extent can you really control things that are happening very far from you? And by that, I mean that, you could be a Bangladeshi manufacturer in Dhaka, and you might have problems which are at a factory, further down in Barishal or in Jashore or somewhere else in Bangladesh. And how do you deal with that? So that will always be a problem. Inspection and other measures are tools to do it. I mean, brands have tried to measure, but they cannot go during COVID. So these are difficult. And the survey we did also was based on cell phones, with Brack University. So there are always going to be barriers, and they need to be overcome. And if I can take half a minute, there was a question on reshoring from, I think, someone, that whether it is, will it happen, or is it possible? We did ask this both to brands and to supplier, and the response we got was very interesting, that they don't think it's that feasible, because some of the countries in the West, Britain, Europe, and in the US, textile industries left 30 years ago, 40 years. There's no institutional memory. There are some of those, I mean, there are of course people who know how to operate machines, but that industry has vanished. So I think we will need to think of creative ways and stronger ways to strengthen the mechanisms of accountability where the industry is, and make sure that it is more efficient, rather than try to imagine that, let's bring the jobs back, because that's not going to happen. The world has moved on from that. But that's what we hear from others. I mean, others may have different views. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Salil. I see Leila has her hand raised.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Can I just follow up on what Salil says, because I think it's extremely important. There's a sort of misunderstanding here. There's no such thing as reverse globalization. You know, the jobs are not going to go back to the UK to produce jeans. It's not like that. Also, you have to have in mind that if there is no work in Bangladesh, then what will they do? You know, what would these women do? What would these workers do? So in this regard, the supply chain is not to be condemned entirely. It's also very good for businesses to bring work in Bangladesh in a very sort of ironical, cynical way. You know, what would you do with Bangladeshi workers without work who would like to migrate to Europe?
Thank you. Nazma, I'll give the floor to you. You have 1 minute to conclude. My apologies that it cannot be longer.
Because we respect the business, and business should be respect workers. That is we want, and we need job, but we don't want it to be charity. We need our recognition. That's important. And thank you very much to into space and give us the equal share, give us the our opinion, what is need for the good for the business. Only listen to the business community, the brand, because they have money and they have power. No, without us, they cannot survive. So let's work together, workers, and freedom of expression is very important. And we need power, we need systemic change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nazma, for your for the final concluding remarks of this session. I want to thank all the panelists and all the participants that joined us today. It was a really enriching conversation. Thank you all for your astute conclusions and observations. And I think I would also ask all the participants to please join the other sessions during the forum, because I also think many of these topics that were discussed today will feature in other sessions. So with that, I would like to close the session and thank you all.